Jason Short from New Zealand is P3 on Supers. Todd is P2 on Supers. Dave B Racing is third. Todd is P2. Best lap is a 1:58.027. Jason Short is P1 on Supers. Best lap is a 1:58.016. The qualification session is at Brabham Circuit 2014 in Eastern Creek, Australia. Jason Short from New Zealand is P1 on Supers. That Canadian guy from Canada is P2 on Supers. Jason Short is P1. The race dictator from New Zealand is third on Supers. That Canadian guy is second. Dave B Racing from South Africa is fifth on Supers. Jason Short is first. Jason Short improved his P1 with a 156.773. That Canadian guy is 5th. Todd from New Zealand is 4th on Supers. Todd improved his 4th with a 158.042. 1.269 off pole. That Canadian guy is 3rd up 0.20. Jason Short is P1 up 0.33. Best lap is a 156.773. Five minutes remaining in the session. That Canadian guy is P3 up 0.43. Jason Short is P1 up 0.23. Jason Short is provisional pole with a 156.573. The race dictator is 2nd. The race dictator improved his 2nd with a 156.602. 0.029 off pole. Todd is provisional pole with a 156.560. Jason Short is P2 up 0.18. The race dictator is P3 up 0.28. Jason Short is P2 up 0.30. Best lap is a 156.573. 0.013 off pole. Jason Short is provisional pole with a 155.171. That Canadian guy is 4th up 0.66 on Supers. That Canadian guy improved his 4th with a 157.160. 1.989 off pole. race dictator is P2 up 0.26. The qualifying session is now in overtime. The race dictator improved his second with a 155.645. 0.474 off pole. That Canadian guy is P4 up 0.29. Race dictator is P2 up 0.22 on supers. Jason Short is P1. Best lap is a 155.171. Broadcast bot is P20 on softs. The race session is at Brabham Circuit 2014, in Eastern Creek, Australia. Jason Short is P1. The race dictator from New Zealand is P2 on supers. Todd from New Zealand is third on supers. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. Todd lost third to that Canadian guy. Todd lost fourth to Dave B Racing. Jason Short from New Zealand is P2 on supers. Jason Short is now P5. Todd is P2. Racing from South Africa is P3 on Supers. Todd is second. Todd is now first. Dave B Racing is second. Jason Short is fourth. Dave B Racing is second. The race dictator is P3, 4.0 ahead of Jason Short. Jason Short exiting pits on Supers. Todd is P2, 0.3 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is P3, 0.3 behind Todd. That Canadian guy from Canada is P4 on Supers, 3.9 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P3, 1.0 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is P4 on Supers, 3.8 behind the race dictator. The race dictator on lap 2 is third, 0.8 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is fourth, 3.5 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy was 1.5 faster last lap. The race dictator is P3. Best lap is a 1:59.608. 1.934 off the fastest lap. That Canadian guy is P4, 3.9 behind the race dictator. 15 minutes remaining in the session. The race dictator is P3, 0.9 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is fourth, 3.7 behind the race dictator. The race dictator from New Zealand is third, 0.6 behind Todd. The race dictator was 4.9 faster last lap. That Canadian guy is P4, 3.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator from New Zealand is P3, 0.4 behind Todd. That Canadian guy on lap 4 is P4, 3.1 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P3, 0.5 behind Todd. That Canadian guy on lap 4 is 4th, 2.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P3, 0.4 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is P4, 2.3 behind the race dictator. Todd is second, 2.7 ahead of that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy was 0.8 faster last lap. Race dictator exiting pits on supers. That Canadian guy is third. Best lap is a 1:56.652. 0.902 off the fastest lap. Todd is P2, 2.6 ahead of that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is P3, 3.0 behind Todd. Todd is second, 2.5 ahead of that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P5. Best lap is a 1:57.123. 1.373 off the fastest lap. 10 minutes remaining in the session. Todd is second, 3.8 behind Dave B Racing. The race dictator is fourth, 3.6 behind Jason Short. Todd from New Zealand is second, 3.6 behind Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy exiting pits on Supers. The race dictator is P4, 3.5 behind Jason Short. Todd on lap 6 is P2, 3.0 behind Dave B Racing. The race dictator is P4, 3.4 behind Jason Short. That Canadian guy is fifth. Dave B Racing exiting pits on Supers. Todd exiting pits on Supers. Dave B Racing from South Africa is second, 0.8 behind Jason Short. The race dictator is third, 2.2 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is second, 0.9 behind Jason Short. Jason Short was 1.8 faster last lap. Todd on lap 7 is P4, 2.9 behind the race dictator. Dave B Racing on lap 7 is P2, 1.1 behind Jason Short. The race dictator on lap 7 is third, 2.4 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing from South Africa is P2, 0.9 behind Jason Short. The race dictator is third, 2.2 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P2, 0.9 behind Jason Short. 5 minutes remaining in the session. The race dictator on lap 8 is third, 2.4 behind Dave B Racing. The race dictator was 18.6 faster last lap. Dave B Racing is second, 0.5 behind Jason Short. The race dictator is third, 1.5 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is second, 0.6 behind Jason Short. The Race Dictator is third, 1.0 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is second, 0.7 ahead of the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator was 1.4 faster last lap. The Race Dictator is third. Best lap is a 156.212. 0.462 off the fastest lap. Dave B Racing is second, 0.7 behind Jason Short. The Race Dictator is third on Supers, 0.8 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is second, 1.0 behind Jason Short. The Race Dictator is P3, 0.4 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing on lap 9 is second, 0.2 ahead of the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is P3, 0.4 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing on lap 10 is P2, 0.2 ahead of the Race Dictator. Dave B Racing lost P2 to the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator on lap 10 is P2, 0.4 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.3 behind the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is P2, 0.5 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3. Best lap is a 157.524. 1.774 off the fastest lap. The Race Dictator is second, 0.5 behind Jason Short. The leader has just finished the race. Jason Short finished first. The Race Dictator finished second. Dave B Racing finished third. Todd finished P4. That Canadian guy is fifth. Canadian guy finished 5th. Broadcast bot is P6. The race session is at Brabham Circuit 2014, in Eastern Creek, Australia. That Canadian guy from Canada is first on Supers. Todd from New Zealand is P2 on Supers. Dave B. Racing from South Africa is P3 on Supers. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. Dave B. Racing is now second. The race dictator from New Zealand is P3 on Supers. Todd is fourth. Jason Short from New Zealand is third on Supers. The race dictator entering the pits is P5. Todd is fourth. Todd is now third. Jason Short is second. The race session is at Brabham Circuit 2014, in Eastern Creek, Australia. Jason Short from New Zealand is P1 on Supers. "20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. Jason Short is now P5. That Canadian guy from Canada is second on Supers. Jason Short is P4. Jason Short is now P3. The race dictator from New Zealand is second on Supers. Jason Short is P3. The race dictator is P2. Jason Short is third. The race dictator is P2. Jason Short is P3, 1.5 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy is first, 1.4 ahead of the race dictator. Jason Short exiting pits on Supers. The race dictator is P2, 2.0 behind that Canadian guy. Todd from New Zealand is third on Supers. Best lap is a 2:10.928. 4.683 off the fastest lap. The race dictator is second, 1.8 behind that Canadian guy. Todd is third, 2.0 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P2, 2.5 ahead of Todd. Todd is P3, 2.3 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is second, 2.5 ahead of Todd. Minutes remaining in the session. Todd is third, 3.3 behind the race dictator. Todd was 1.0 faster last lap. The race dictator is second, 1.7 behind that Canadian guy. Todd is third. Best lap is a 1:57.727. 0.993 off the fastest lap. The race dictator is P2, 2.1 behind that Canadian guy. Todd is third. Best lap is a 1:57.608. 0.874 off the fastest lap. The race dictator is second, 1.7 behind that Canadian guy. Todd is P3, 2.7 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is second, 1.1 behind that Canadian guy. Todd is third on supers, 2.6 behind the race dictator. The race dictator was 0.6 faster last lap. Jason Short is fifth on supers, 4.5 behind Dave B Racing. Jason Short was 1.7 faster last lap. The race dictator is P3 on supers, 1.0 ahead of that Canadian guy. The race dictator exiting pits on supers. That Canadian guy exiting pits on supers. That Canadian guy is fourth. Best lap is a 1:57.304. 0.570 off the fastest lap. Dave B Racing exiting pits on supers. Jason Short is second, 2.6 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is P4, 0.2 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy was 1.4 faster last lap. Jason Short is second, 0.6 behind Todd. That Canadian guy from Canada is fourth, 0.9 behind the race dictator. Jason Short is second, 0.9 behind Todd. Jason Short was 1.0 faster last lap. 10 minutes remaining in the session. That Canadian guy is P4, 1.3 behind the race dictator. Jason Short on lap 6 is second, 1.0 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is fourth, 1.3 behind the race dictator. Jason Short is second, 3.3 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is P4, 2.9 behind the race dictator. Jason Short is P2, 0.8 behind Todd. Jason Short was 11.7 faster last lap. The race dictator is P3, 0.8 ahead of that Canadian guy. The race dictator was 4.8 faster last lap. Jason Short is second, 0.5 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is P3, 0.5 ahead of that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is fourth, 0.3 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy was 0.9 faster last lap. That Canadian guy is now third. Todd exiting pits on supers. The race dictator on lap 7 is second, 0.4 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing from South Africa is P4 on supers battling that Canadian guy. Dave B Racing passed that Canadian guy for third. The race dictator is P2, 0.3 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing from South Africa is third, 0.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator from New Zealand is second, 0.4 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.6 behind the race dictator. Dave B Racing was 16.7 faster last lap. The race dictator on lap 7 is P2, 0.5 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third, 0.4 behind the race dictator. 5 minutes remaining in the session. The race dictator from New Zealand is P2, 0.5 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.8 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P2, 0.3 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third on Supers, 0.3 behind the race dictator. The race dictator from New Zealand is P2, 0.4 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third, 0.6 ahead of that Canadian guy. The race dictator is second, 0.5 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third, 0.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P2, 0.7 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is P3, 1.8 behind the race dictator. The race dictator on lap 9 is second, 0.7 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third, 2.0 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is second, 0.4 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third, 2.6 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is second, 0.6 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third, 2.8 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is second, 0.3 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third, 3.1 behind the race dictator. The race dictator was 2.3 faster last lap. Jason Short is P2, 0.3 behind the race dictator. Dave B Racing on lap 10 is P3, 2.9 behind Jason Short. The leader has just finished the race. The race dictator finished P1. Jason Short finished P2. Dave B. Racing finished 3rd. That Canadian guy finished 4th. Todd finished P5. Broadcast bot is 6th.